Why is the Switch 2 not an OLED?
Oh!
Andy, why is it not an OLED?
I think we know why the Switch 2 is not an OLED.
We've obviously been hands-on with the Switch 2 very recently. We've done a few videos. If you've not seen them, go and watch them. Very good. Breaking down each part of the Switch 2 that we've experienced.
Yep.
But the biggest question we're getting from the audience is, why is it not an OLED?
Yep.
And does that make it a fail, basically?
Yes. Yeah. And I think that's a good question to ask. And I think for like most like common public are probably wondering this and thinking, oh, just wait or whatever. But there are some actual reasons as to why we think Nintendo haven't used an OLED. But the first thing we want to clear up is our own like confliction here, because we initially said that we thought this panel was going to be mini LED.
Yeah.
And actually getting hands-on at the event, we thought it was just because of how bright it was.
Definitely. Your first reaction to it was at massive brightness, great viewing angles, and the contrast's not so much of a problem that you'd expect going back to an LCD panel.
Yeah.
So your first reaction is probably mini LED that they're using, those local dimming zones and stuff.
Yes, for sure. But, upon reviewing a lot of this footage whilst editing our own videos of hands-on, because obviously when you're hands-on, you're a little bit overwhelmed by everything. Yeah. So in the moment, it's a bit hard to take it all in. But after the fact, looking at some of the footage does seem to be looking like an edge-lit display. Yeah. However, I will say, we keep bashing on about the viewing angles, and one of our lovely commenters cleared this up. That was our like misrepresentation of our own words, I think. Here.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
But yeah, so it's definitely an IPS panel because of those viewing angles. So some people don't realize that mini LED can still be LCD and can be any panel type, I believe. So IPS is the best viewing angles versus VA/TN, where they wash out and you look at them from an angle. So IPS is a check here. Yeah. Now, it's how that IPS panel is lit is then the thing in question here, which generally you've either got like a side lit, or you've got mini LED where it's every individual pixel is lit. Yeah. And that's where you get like the local dimming zones for really good blacks and stuff. But looking at the footage, it doesn't look like that. It does look like side edge lit.
Yeah. I think a part of the problem here as well is that we saw a mid-generation step from most of the handheld makers pushing into OLED, and all the marketing spin was that OLED's going to be the best way you can get the best visual performance from a handheld device. Yes. Which, if you ignore actual performance of a machine and the cost of a machine, is absolutely true. Yeah. But there's some people that still don't like OLED as well, so maybe it's a bit even that's a bit subjective.
Yes. Yeah.
But what you kind of need to address is what Nintendo have done here is why they've not gone OLED and what would be the reasons for that, and perhaps what are the advantages of not being OLED.
Absolutely, yes.
Because that's hard to communicate because we've spent so long talking about why we want OLED.
Yeah.
And everyone's so excited for that. Yes. I think the biggest one is, and you've got to understand Nintendo's perspective, their central focus for everything that they make has always been consistency of the gameplay experience. Yes. So the user has a consistent experience all times.
Yes. Yeah, no matter what. Yes.
And that's where this panel comes into that. Like fundamentally. HDR was really important to them for this. Yep. And you can get HDR on OLED, but obviously we're going to talk about cost in a minute. It becomes a bit prohibitive. But the biggest one is VRR. Yes. Having a high frame rate or high refresh rate monitor with VRR in 7.9 inches. Yeah. Well, you can't do it with OLED. Not without problems. Yeah.
We'll talk on those problems in a second. But let's just take the fact that they're releasing a system with a top spec screen out the gate. We've
fully spec'd.
1080p, 7.9 inch, HDR, VRR G-Sync.
That's kind of crazy.
But that's coming out of the gate here. Yeah. So there's not much room for improvement there. It's fully spec'd out.
Yeah, and when we saw
120 hertz, I think that's what I missed saying.
Yeah, it's really important. When we saw the first Switch launch, the panel wasn't fully spec'd. It wasn't a top-of-the-range panel at that time.
Standard 720p, 60 FPS.
Yeah, it had none of these features in it. But like you say, Nintendo have coming out the gate. And really, the Switch 2, you could just call the Switch Pro at this point. And it feels like that.
I alluded to that in one of the other videos.
So if they were keeping the generations to run concurrently, everything about this would sit above the Switch. Switch OLED. Even the panel itself sits above the OLED because of how fully spec'd it is.
The feature spec, 120 hertz, G-Sync VRR, HDR.
And those parts are massively important to the consistency of experience. 120 hertz is ridiculous. Yes. To be playing games handheld at 120 hertz, even if it's upscaled from that 720 base, whatever it is they're upscaling from.
It'd be far lower.
Maybe 540, maybe.
Yeah,
even.
but maybe even lower again, just purely because...
Should we just keep going down the numbers? 360.
Just because to hit the 120 mark, we're going to be having to run games at 720p.
Yep.
So like we saw in Metroid Prime, it was the option handheld of 1080p 60 or 720p 120.
Yeah.
So we're going to be low, resolution spec for that.
And when we're talking about these very low powered, as in like low wattage handheld devices, getting consistent frame rates is difficult.
Yep.
And getting high base frame rates is difficult, as in like the 1% lows. Those stuttering moments that would cause an inconsistent gameplay experience, which is the opposite of what Nintendo wants.
Yes.
That's where a VRR panel
is necessary.
Yes, it's absolutely necessary.
Yeah. And everyone says that we overhyped like the Asus ROG Ally, but we're not overhyped at all. It's a fantastic display on that, because that too has a 120 hertz VRR panel, and when we got our hands on it, it is night and day, mind-blowing, because it doesn't matter where the game's at in terms of frame rate. If you've got the frame rate counter off, your eyes cannot detect the difference, the fluctuation. Whereas if you didn't have VRR, where it smooths out that massive peaks and lows, then you see the Mark Cerny choppiness start coming in. So VRR is definitely, Nintendo said we need that because, like you said, low power output.
Low power.
FPS is going to be everywhere.
Yep.
So,
and we want that consistency of experience. Easy for me to say. In a dream world, you would have these fully spec'd features on an OLED panel.
Yes.
If you were to do like a budgetless dream.
Yeah.
But also, before we get to the budget, you would also put huge millions behind developing an OLED technology that doesn't suffer from VRR flicker.
Yes.
Which plays into the consistency of experience thing.
Yes.
Having a flickering image, Nintendo would not release something that would allow that.
No, because they want that consistency. And this is not to us like more nerdy side where we know and can put names on things.
Yeah.
Even if you only approximately know. Like, we're talking about little Billy's experience here.
Yes.
Nintendo want little Billy to sit there and enjoy his game uninterrupted.
Yes.
Forget that you're playing on a machine, be in the game. And if there's stuttering, flickering, or anything else, that's going to take you out of the experience.
Yeah.
And that's what they don't want.
Yeah.
And we know that VRR flicker on OLED panels will absolutely break your immersion.
Yeah, so this is the kind of important compromise to make. And I think they did a really good job with making a fully spec'd compromise.
Yeah, absolutely.
Especially considering the cost that this is releasing at. When you look at the alternative handhelds on the market, it's coming in at like half the cost.
Absolutely.
It's kind of insane. And the cost part's a really important segue to the other reason why this isn't an OLED panel.
Yes.
The cost versus performance versus what the return's going to be on this console.
Yeah.
A really important measure. Everyone's already quite upset about the cost of the hardware and the cost of the software. The cost, if you were to have that fully spec'd OLED, and let's say in a Fantasyland you managed to fix VRR flicker as well, I think you'd be touching on the Asus ROG Ally prices.
Absolutely. Imagine an 8-inch 120 hertz OLED VRR with a G-Sync module potentially there, right? And HDR, launch day price, that's going to be sky high.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like absolutely sky high. And I personally still don't even think the technology's there to do it yet.
I don't think it's possible. I've got a big question mark with, I'm going to kind of go into a bit of a segue. Lenovo are releasing the Go 2, Legion Go 2.
Yep.
That's supposed to have an OLED with VRR.
Yeah.
But there's no date on that yet.
No,
so
no date.
We don't know if they've actually fixed it or not either.
No, only a prototype. And I do just want to really quickly round this off for anyone that doesn't know what we're talking about. We've been talking about VRR flicker for a long time.
Yeah.
But OLEDs suffer from flickering with inconsistent frame rates. So when there's a big dip, so if you're at, like, let's just say you're at 100 FPS and you're locked in there, and then all of a sudden it drops down to 40 for a split second, or even for a few seconds because the game's really hard to run, right? that inconsistent frame jump up and down there will then cause the dark areas. It's not the whole screen. It's only the dark areas of the screen to then have like a gamma flicker, like a
strobing.
And it's very noticeable. However, you can get around this by having a high-powered machine, like I have. I've got multiple OLEDs in my house.
Yeah.
So my PC monitor, the new one, is a 240 hertz OLED, and because I've got a powerful machine, 9800 X3D processor with a 9070 XT, I can maintain a high 1% low with a higher average to the point where there's no VRR flicker. But like you were going back to, a low-powered handheld, a Nintendo handheld.
What's it running at like 10, 15 watts or something?
It'll be so low, it won't be able to have raw performance to keep that 1% low high enough to get around that flicker.
Yeah. The other part with the cost, going back to the money part of it, obviously, if it was possible, even if it wasn't possible and they just pretended and just launched it with an OLED and said, deal with the flicker, which they're not going to if they're going to be porting games like Cyberpunk, like Elden Ring, games that are like high-performance games that have a lot of dark areas, it's visually important. But even if they did, the entry point cost is going to be massively higher. It's going to be like $200 higher at least.
Oh, yeah.
Just for the panel.
Yeah.
Then there's also the caveat is that the Switch 2, despite the success of the Switch 1, is not a guaranteed success for Nintendo.
No, exactly.
It's a huge risk.
Yeah, this could be, like, in their minds, they're sat at the boardroom going, is this a Wii U?
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Because every time they've gone into, like, the high-performance gaming, when they've touched on, like we're going to be, like, a console gamer now. We're going to launch the GameCube. We're going to launch the Wii. It's like going to power through things. We're going to have proper third-party titles on there. It's never done that well compared to when they don't.
Yes, precisely. Yeah. The GameCube massively undersold.
What did you say? Was it
22 million sold?
It's just crazy.
Yeah.
Even the N64 you said was
33 or 34 million. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely insane. So it's not a guaranteed success that this is going to do well for them. I would imagine it's going to do well. It's
going to do really well, but I fully think that's another reason where that cost comes into play.
Yeah.
They're like, we don't want to release it with an OLED panel that jumps the price another $200 up. And the other thing is, just to finish the VRR flicker thing, the only way around it is to cap frame rates so that there is no variable.
Yeah.
Right? So if they did release it with an OLED, this would have had to have been a 60 hertz panel where they could VSync lock games
40
in
FPS
at a certain frame rate and keep it there.
Yeah.
Which they clearly didn't want.
No, they didn't want. They've made a really big thing in all their kind of the directs and at these events of showing off like the 120 FPS, showing off the 120 hertz.
Yeah.
It's a really big deal for them.
Yeah, because of that mouse mode as well. I think that plays in part with it.
It massively does. Yeah. And I guess the final point really on like, why is it not, is why does it matter? Or does it even matter?
Does it matter? That's the thing.
I started this off with saying we've been spoilt or kidded, and I'm not sure which it is, with the mid-generation bumps with the Steam Deck and the Switch of being OLED and us as well, and everyone making a big deal of it, because the improvement from the LCD panel versions was massive.
Yeah.
But the LCD panel versions were really under-spec'd.
Yeah, they were bad at the time.
Standard panels.
Because, again, the Switch was a real no-no for Nintendo. They really didn't know if this was going to do well because the Wii U real failed.
Yeah.
So that's why it had an underperforming chip at launch and a crap screen, because they were like, you know what? This could be the end of us.
and the same when we look over to the Steam Deck as another handheld.
Yeah.
When they launched it, it was very expensive at launch. First of all, it was more than the Switch 2 is at launch.
Yeah,
it was $399 for the LCD 64 gig.
Yeah,
they dropped the price quite quickly.
Yeah.
But it was a massive unknown.
Yes.
Because other Valve hardware had flopped massively.
Yeah.
So it was a massive unknown. But as soon as they saw, both Nintendo and Valve saw that these handhelds were a success, then they introduced the mid-generation bump with a much more spec'd screen.
Yep.
And the only way that they could do that at the time was OLED.
Yes.
So we all got very excited for that, and the visual difference was huge. What we're saying now is into this next generation, the visual difference is huge again, coming from an OLED to this.
Yeah.
Because of how fully spec'd that screen is.
Yeah. You're going from no spec OLED to fully fledged, like full spec LCD. And it's a decent panel. Like getting hands on.
And that's my point. Yeah,
is really good.
The final point is like, does it matter? And I would 100% say it does not matter. If you're on the fence at all and you're still holding on to OLED is really important, reserve your judgment until you see it.
Yes, get hands on, because My first hands-on impression with the Steam Deck LCD was the screen's crap.
Yes.
Like literally, I turned the thing on.
I remember you saying, you said to your wife and you said to me in text, like, it's amazing, but as soon as they launch an OLED version, I'm going to buy that.
Yes, and that was a valid like jump because it was so much backlight bleed and everything. It was disgusting that an OLED was actually viable as a change, and that's where we were thinking Switch 2 was mini LED just by how vibrant it was and how saturated those colors were as well because of the brightness. Because it looks good. This is not a poor LCD screen. So whilst we think now that it is an IPS edge lit, it's a good panel.
Very good.
Like, I'm happy with it. I didn't pick this up and go, oh no. You know, I picked it up and went, wow, look how bright it is.
First reaction. I had the same visceral gut reaction as to when I saw an OLED panel on the Steam Deck for the first time.
Yeah.
Like, wow, that's impressive.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of says everything about it.
Absolutely. I think we've cleared that up.
Yeah. If you've got any more questions, put them in the comments down below. Honestly, joining the conversation. We want to cover as much about Switch 2 as possible as we can before launch and after it when we get hands-on fully too. We're here. We're not going away handheld gaming to the end. Joining the conversation down below. And what else should they do, Andy?
Like the video, subscribe.
Of course. Why not?
Become a member. You get to talk to us over on our private Discord. And have a nice tea.
It's the best.
It's just coming to every video now.
Yeah.